Welcome everybody to tonight's webinar on the origins of Melbourne YCW in 1941. To begin with, I'm going to hand over to Ruby Glenister from Melbourne YCW, who's going to do the Acknowledgement of Country for us. Over to you, Ruby.
Thank you. I would like to begin by recognising and acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of the lands we're on today, and any First Nations people here with us. Even though we are meeting on a digital platform, I wish to take this opportunity to recognise the importance of the lands we call home. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their cultures and connections to the land and waters of this country.
Thanks very much, Ruby. And now I'll do a little opening prayer just to go a bit further. I'll share the screen here. And hope it's coming up on the screen now. How do I? Well, look, I won't. I should have made it full screen, but I won't worry about it. But I just wanted to mention tonight a former Melbourne YCW leader, Mick Irwin, who was also a Richmond and Collingwood footballer, who died a few days ago. I thought it'd be very appropriate to remember him because he was not just a YCW footballer, but he was a YCW leader. And I got a beautiful testimony from another former YCW member earlier this week by the name of Tom Sinclair, who said that when, as a young lad, having left school in the country to go to Melbourne to get a job, I boarded with Mick and his family. It was he who got me interested in the YCW. Lovely man. So yeah, I'd just like to remember Mick Irwin in this little opening prayer that we'll do. And there's many versions of the YCW prayer around the world in different languages. But tonight I'm going to use the one which was the first translation ever used in Australia. I'm not sure if it was translated by Kevin Kelly or by Paul Maguire, but it appeared in a book called YCW 1939. Possibly Val may refer to that little booklet. And I'll go read it with you as our opening prayer. Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and all my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to pray through you, to live in you, to give you all my strength and all my time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, workshops and offices, and in all our homes. Be everywhere, better known, better loved, better served. Deliver us forever from injustice and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labour's battlefield rest in peace. Amen. Sacred Heart of Jesus, bless the young Christian workers. Sacred Heart of Jesus, sanctify the young Christian workers. Sacred Heart of Jesus, may your kingdom come through the young Christian workers. Queen of Apostles, pray for us. So yeah, as you can see, the early YCW had a very strong concept of the working class and the battles that workers faced, including up to the point of dying on Labour's battlefield. I think it's good for us to remember that. Yeah, look, so now I've moved to introducing Val, who's going to speak to us tonight. I think many of you here tonight already know Val, so I don't need to say a lot. But he did start off in the YCS as a high school student at De La Salle, Melbourne. And I guess that was his first introduction to the whole, everything that Cardine was on about. Later, as a young priest in St Albans and at Frankston, possibly elsewhere, he was a local YCW chaplain working with young workers and students. Still later, he was a full-time collaborator for the Melbourne YCW during the 1980s. In between times, he also studied as an academic with a PhD on Melbourne Catholics and the Vietnam War, and also later became a noted specialist in Irish history in Australia. And he's extremely well recognised for that. So Val, you come to us with a great deal of experience and also academic knowledge as well. So thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
How terrific to have so many people online, Steph. And what a treat to have Ruby do the acknowledgement for country. Like a number of people who I see on screen, lucky enough to have worked with Bill Roberts, her grandfather, in Action for World Development. where he became the founding dentist at the first Melbourne Aboriginal Dental Service. So nice to see the spirit of Bill Roberts coming down through it in a Ruby. Good on you. This is, as the advertisement said, I'm going to highlight the roles of Father Frank Lombard and the lay leaders Ted Long and Frank McCann in beginning the boys section of the Young Christian Workers here in my own hometown. And I'm going to put that into context and a few of the puzzles that go with it. Look, in recent years, for very good reasons, those writing about Australian Catholicism have focused on exposing and redressing the crimes of clerical sexual abuse. Well, this talk offers an alternative aspect of what the post-1941 Australian Catholics were on about. I'm going to share my screen now, Steph, see how we go. Okay, I've got 6 points. I mean, good speakers only have 3, but there, I got 6 tonight, folks. Well, there's Lombard, there's McCann, there's Long, yeah, the latter, of course, in older age. Here's a picture of the South Yarra branch in the 1950s, just to remind you a bit of what people look like. The Elvis head cut has come around. Okay, here's a summary of the story I'm going to give you. And given the present state of the world and of the Catholic Church, it's going to sound a bit like a fairy tale. In 1941, that's 85 years ago, in Melbourne, a large industrial city on the Kulin lands, an energetic group of young priests and lay activists persuaded a Catholic archbishop to give formal authorisation, but in fact only limited funding, to take over a large pre-existing sports and social Catholic youth organisation called Catholic Boys Legion and turn that into an Australianised version of a new style lay organisation, Belgian-based, Vatican-approved, a movement founded by Joseph Cardine and known as the Young Christian Workers. A distinctive feature of the new organisation was the formation of leaders groups, which discussed the application of Christ's teachings to daily life, especially in, as the prayer said, factories, farms, offices and workshops. Through a method known as the inquiry, the catch cry was, see, judge and act, and the slogan was, a new youth for a new Australia. And all the while, the leaders of the groups, they ran sporting teams and dances. The priests and the lay leaders also aimed at building Catholic community, fostering Catholic marriages, improving mass attendance, and so on. But not everything went according to plan. However, within a decade, Melbourne YCW had over 10,000 members and flourished for more than 30 years. That's a bit of the fairy tale, isn't it? Recently, David Maloney, who's not an YCW person, but a heritage historian, he listed some of the achievements. He named workplace actions of defending the rights of apprentices and more recently the rights of casual workers. Maloney highlighted, of course, the housing co-ops, which their focus on budgeting for family life. He reckons that at one time the YCW ran the largest amateur football competition in Australia. Well, as Ruby knows, a tiny movement continues today. And we probably could count on the fingers of 2 hands the number of children and grandchildren from YCW members of the glory years who have been active or are active in YCW or are indeed active in the Catholic Church. Young activists are joining environmental or human rights or meditation, yoga, other groups. And most young people now have views on women and sexuality and science that are rejected by the Church. As far as I can tell, none of the prerequisites are in place for a repetition of the YCW heydays, glory days. So why bother with tonight's topic? So I put it to you that in this 21st century, anyone concerned about the well-being of young people, and indeed of humanity as a whole, which is now what is at risk, can learn from YCW history precisely because the founders built a successful movement, but I shouldn't say that precisely belongs to the next phrase, precisely because they were concerned about the 99% of the population and their everyday life. New generations can benefit from learning about YCW methods and goals and reapply them, I believe, in different situations. I have here a note on the National Catholic Girls Movement. In 1941, Archbishop Mannix also declared the National Catholic Girls Movement to be official Catholic action. It was for working women 14 to 25, and in 1959 it took up the name YCW. Betty King has done a outstanding job of putting the story on record, and she's placed material in the archives at the Melbourne Diocesan Commission, and she put some material also into the YCW's own archives. Geraldine Craig and Catherine Massam have also been recording NCGM history. That's a picture of a group NCGM members who are meeting regularly. I couldn't get a very good image up on the YCW logo there, sorry, the NCGM logo. However, the major limitation of this talk and of my book is the lack of attention to the girls section, and I apologise today for that, and I'll leave that to others to do. I want to now move to my third point, which is a question about what was the state of the Catholic Church in relation to the working class in 1941, and I'm going to suggest that we need to revise or rethink a bit of our thinking from the 30s. In 1941, the Catholic Church in Australia was a predominantly working class church. This was in contrast with continental Europe, whereas the Pope and everybody else had said the great scandal was the loss of the workers to the church. At least from 1910, Cardinal Patrick Moran had encouraged Catholics to be active in the Labor Party. In Melbourne, Archbishop Mannix supported the Labor movement in their opposition to conscription in World War I. He supported the waterside workers' strike in 1917, the seamen's strike in 1919. And in the Great Depression, he spoke up, at least initially, for workers' rights. The problem is to locate, therefore, the YCW back against the background of the 1930s depression first. In 1932, at the height of the depression, 1 in 3, probably more, Australian workers were unemployed. Thousands of people lost their homes and their businesses and their savings. So the workers as a whole decided that capitalism had failed, but they also decided that the ALP had failed, as indeed it proved to be too big a problem for the Labor government. So in 1941, people like Lombard, Long and McCann were facing a deteriorating context, which I want to come to next. In a minute, I should say. I want to now tell you about a university-based group, the Campion Society, which became prominent. In 1931, a lawyer, Frank Marr, and other university students formed study groups to increase lay life in the Catholic Church with a view to restoring Christianity to its central role against secularism and against communism. They called their organisation after an English saint, not an Irish one, the Campion Society. There's a little picture from the Depression years. Arthur Corwell put that broadsheet out in about 1936, and they tried to sack him in the public service for doing so. But as a rule, the Campions wrote and spoke about intellectual life, and they were not in everyday contact with manual workers. However, in 1936, they started a monthly newspaper called The Catholic Worker, which had a substantial circulation. When the Spanish Civil War began in 1936, the Melbourne Catholic Worker paper and most Catholic papers in Australia and the bishops supported the right-wing General Franco and his forces in an armed rebellion against the elected Republican and secular government. That war led to hundreds of thousands of casualties. In contrast, Dorothy Day and the New Catholic Worker in America refused to support what she called a holy war in Spain to crush the Reds. She refused. She shared that refusal with the international trade union movement, and Dorothy declared the paper neutral. A number of Australian Catholic political figures, Frank Brennan of the ALP member for Northcote, he agreed with Dorothy Day. Many Catholic workers in the trade unions also supported the Republic through funds that they raised through their unions. I found in recent years that Father Bill Rivera from a Catalan family is a curate at Bacchus Marsh, and he's said to have supported the Republic, but the parish priests by and large supported Franco. And I've also come across the story of Kevin Rebecki from St Joseph's, West Brunswick, who fought and died for the Republic with the international brigades. So I want to say we've got to look again at that period. Be that as it may, I'm going to keep moving today. I'm going to pack in a fair bit of stuff. Pardon me if I'm moving fast, but I'd rather give you an overview of the material rather than dwell on points. By 1939, this group of campions, there's a picture of Jimmy Rebecki, the guy at the left at the back, 21-year-old boy from St Joseph's. He's at the border about to cross out of Spain into France, but he died of typhoid before he could get out of the country. So I want to come now to what the campions did. By 1939, they persuaded the Australian bishops to set up an organisation called the National Secretariat of Catholic Action, ANSCA, A-N-S-C-A. And they employed Ma, who was the founder of the campions, as a director, and Bartholomew Santamaria, Bob Santamaria, 24, a brilliant law graduate, as the assistant director. By 46, he became the director. The bishops gave ANSCA, the National Secretariat of Catholic Action, 2 tasks: set up specialised national Catholic action organisations, and in a negative mode, stimulate Catholic workers to be active trade unions to defeat the influence of the left, particularly the Communist Party of Australia, then 17 years old. Well, I want to put to you that one of the striking things about the 30s is the loss of Labor militants to the church due to the Depression and Spain. In the 60s and 70s, when I got involved in the Vietnam peace movement, I got to know people from Catholic childhoods who had joined the Communist Party during the Depression. And they all said it was over Spain and the Depression. And the key reason they always gave was that the Communist Party had offered them hope. So I tell you all this because I think the people trying to start the YCW in 1941 faced an extremely tricky situation, but they had a positive social justice option on offer. Joseph Cardine thought that to be merely anti-communist in a negative sense was to do nothing. Being anti-communist, he knew, was often a smokescreen for opposing any redistribution of wealth. That picture there is a key person in getting the knowledge about Cardine and the YCW into Melbourne, Kevin Kelly. He's not the first Australian to have contact with Cardine. Stefan, I think, has suggested that Justin Simmons, who became later a bishop, was a young priest studying at Louvain in the 20s, and he met Cardine then. Max Vidola, who wrote the biography of him, said the bishop, he was the foremost authority on the young Christian workers, and he gave wholehearted support to the YCW in the various political tensions that they faced. And Steph's also drawn attention to a 1930 article by a Jesuit who was teaching at the seminary at Werribee, George O'Neill, where Frank Lombard was a student. Frank would have heard this as a young student, a very, very upbeat account of the Belgian and French YCW in the diocesan newspaper, The Advocate. Okay, so Kelly was a student of arts and law at Melbourne Uni, but he's from a working class Labor Party oriented family. He linked up with the French and he became prominent in making the YCW known. That's the front page of the Worker in Melbourne in 1939, a report on a Cardine, that's Cardine addressing a rally of 80,000, do you believe that? 80,000 Belgian workers. And how's the subheading? Who will be Australia's Cardine? Well, in 1940, Santa Maria published a booklet to support that idea called How to Start the JOC. JOC, I think as most of you will know, is the French Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, young Christian workers. But the biographer of Santa Maria, Gerard Henderson, says that in reality, Santa Maria had no time for Cardine's inquiry method. By 1941, the Campions had split, by the way, another background factor to the starting the YCW. One group retaining the Catholic Worker newspaper, which was friendly to YCW and Simmons, the others joining Santa Maria and indeed Mannix on a slippery slope to the right. Now, I want to go to point 4 now, if you wouldn't mind. The young priests and the lay activists in the industrial suburbs of Melbourne are the ones who started the YCW. Out in the parishes in the 30s and into the 1940s, activists, priests and laymen were experimenting with the new form of Catholic organisation, which they called, and we call, I suppose, to this day, JOCIS, based on those French initials. Although the Campions had been publicising Cardine and the YCW, they had not started the YCW, nor did Santa Maria. The Campions' base was among university students and graduates, and the emphasis was on study and intellectual discussions. A group of young priests stationed in the industrial suburbs were more in touch with working class youths than the Campions were. And in July 1939, but indeed helped by the Campions, they formed a thing called the Melbourne YCW Priests Committee with the aim of starting the YCW. And this was, I think, a very important turning point. While the high percentage of Catholic boys amongst juvenile offenders was discussed, on present evidence, a usual starting point in their discussions was also the high rate of lapse of church attendance by the boys after they turn 14 and go to work. You remember, don't you, that until about 1960, most people left school at 14. And what they were worried about was in the non-Christian environment of the factory, the workshop or the office, they stopped going to church. John F. Kelly at West Melbourne, a famous educator, a head of Catholic education later on, as a young priest, wrote in his diary in 1939, "Seeing a boy last night, 17, Catholic school, altar boy, quiet, law-abiding, yet abandoned Mass and sacraments immediately he left school. He is one of hundreds. The need of an Australian YCW is urgent." This, of course, echoes Cardine's experience. John F. Kelly used the name JOC because he also had French. He and Father Cleary of Geelong had been reading and translating the French materials as Kevin Kelly, in the lay group had also been doing. Kelly tried out a YCW group at West Melbourne that year, actually, in 39. Out at Oakley, Dan Hogan had a go at starting a group, and Eric Nyland had another trial group as well. And in Clifton Hill, Dave Nelson, I've got a picture of him later on, he also had a go at starting a group. In fact, priests and laity in a number of parishes had tried YCW type frameworks or approaches in the CYMS, the Catholic Young Men's Society. I just got to turn over again, more thumbs here. The Legion of Mary even, they tried to see how would Cardine's principles work in the Legion. They tried it in the Catholic Boys Legion. Frank Lombard, son of Irish immigrants, his father a policeman, the recently ordained assistant priest at Northcote, he also had a go at experimenting. He in fact turned out to be the key organiser amongst that group of young activist priests. I'll just name two others. They can stand for the general group on this occasion. Father Vin Arthur had an experimental YCW group at North Melbourne, St Michael's, and several of the key founders come out of that one group. It's very interesting, therefore, the influence of Vin Arthur. The key founders were Charles and Frank McCann, Leo Tyrrell, and Ted Long. And I'll give you a bit more about Kelly's, John F. Kelly's influence. He decided in 1940 to start a newsletter called the JOC Chaplain, or just the Chaplain. But other members of the Priests Committee were active in other existing branches of this Catholic Boys League. It was enormously successful. The very hard-working priest called Joseph Lanigan had built that up. The sporting and social activities were in a way thriving. And Lombard tried in vain to work with Lanigan to get him to incorporate the Cardine approach, and that didn't work out, and that was a bit of a cause for tension. Ted Long, who became the first president, had an interesting remark about how he got into the YCW. He told David Keogh, who we're going to talk about in a minute, at 18, Long was boarding in Kensington. He was working as a public servant. He was captain of the local Catholic Boys League footy team. And through a housemate called Dan Hogan, he came in contact with the Campion Society, the intellectual university group. Keogh summed up what he heard from Long. After a few Campion meetings, this quiet, intelligent, pensive boy from the country could see a contrast between the rarefied explanations of the Catholic intellectual culture and the real problems of the young workers in his football team, who lounged in gangs on street corners in South Kensington after work and on weekends. In September in 41, Long attended a meeting of that priest group and was so inspired by Lombard's compassion for young workers that he became a member of the YCW and formed a group at North Melbourne. Oh, how are we going? We want to go now to the YCW taking over the Catholic Boys Legion. There are more polite ways of saying it, but in fact, I think looking at it from a distance, what they did, let's stick with that for the moment. Sorry. That's the one I want. From Boxing Day in 40 to New Year's Day in 41, the Catholic Boys Legion ran a Catholic Action leadership training camp down at Mornington on the Franciscan Fathers' property there. Now, 3 months early, Mannix, the Archbishop, and the Catholic Action Secretariat had authorised this group, the Catholic Boys Legion, to be Catholic Action for the 14 to 18 group. Now, this camp was a crucial step to the formal launch of the YCW, because the key organisers were Lombard and the Melbourne Priest Committee. They had 100 youths there from 32 parishes under campus. Mannix came down, Simmons came down, and gave them wholehearted support to turning the Catholic Boys Legion into the YCW. That's David Nelson, who was active up in Northcote. And I use that because they had a big rally out at Xavier, and there were 15,000 Catholic Action rally at Xavier in October, and they marshalled 600 young Christian workers to take part in that rally. But now it's not plain sailing for the new official YCW. The first big the big contextual factor is that this is World War II, and this is the years 41 and 42, the years of extreme fear for the future and the survival of Australia. World War II was on the minds of the founders and the members. Thousands of the young male parishioners were in the army. Thousands died in the war or came home maimed. 41 was a particularly crisis-filled year. Australians were fighting in places like Tobruk in North Africa. And in June, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, whose citizens were to suffer 20, perhaps 30 million casualties in their epic defeat of the Germans. But the public perception of the Soviet Union and of communism changed for the better. The Soviet Union was now an ally of the democratic countries, England and United States and Australia, in the fight against Nazism. This worried the Catholic leaders, and it worried the right-wing figures in the ALP. Just mentioned in 42, which is the height of the fears of Japanese invasion because of Pearl Harbor and so on, many of the first wave of YCW members volunteered for the armed services. All were called up. 6 of the 8 executives, that first executive, were conscripted or enlisted. So this is difficult times. That year, some clubs were unable to field their football teams because of the demands of the army and of the manpower. Father Lombard, became a part-time army chaplain to training camps only in Victoria because he was rejected for overseas service because he had had TB in his student days. Now I want to come to the other big complication. The big complication is that Mannix and Santa Maria are at the same time starting a secret political lobby. In August 1941, 1 month before giving the official mandate to YCW, a month before Mannix gave official approval to YCW, he gave private, secret funding to a Catholic action organisation known as the Movement. Santa Maria, the Assistant Director of the National Secretariat, had made the setting up of the movement his priority. Both Paddy Morgan and Gerard Henderson say that he was working on it from as early as 1938. But with the help of most parish priests, Mannix and Santa Maria and their colleagues concentrated on using the parishes as a base for forming secret cells in trade unions and the Labor Party, with the stated aim of opposing offer holders who were members of or were sympathetic to the Communist Party. Now, in practice, and I can't lay out all the arguments today, but I want you to know that this is a firm conclusion of mine. This declaration of the movement's objective was deceitful because that organisation opposed not only communists, but social democrats with whom they disagreed, such as Maurice Blackburn from day one, the day after Mannix Santa Maria held what he calls his first meeting, they went for Maurice Blackburn. They went for Arthur Corwell, Nick McKenna and Jim Ormond, those three were Catholics, because they had policies different from those of the movement leadership. Moreover, rank and file trade union members often stuck with hard-working Communist Union officials, such as J.J. Brown and Jim Healy, both from Catholic families, regardless of the movement's attempt to demonise him. Now, there's a lot in that, and I can't unpack it, but I think you will grasp, and you probably already know, tension between Santa Maria and the YCW affected the YCW from the earliest years. Conflict worsened, of course, as you know, and became public knowledge later after the movement's role in the 1954 split in the Labor Party. The YCW members, no, the YCW founders and members were opposed to communism, but they shared Cardine's rejection of negative anti-communism. The YCW found Santa Maria undemocratic and authoritarian. They wanted an open, not a secret organisation. They retained friendships with Catholic opponents of Santa Maria. Lombard and the YCW had to work very hard, nonetheless, to keep correct relations with Mannix, who was secretly committed at that stage, and openly, of course, from 45 onwards, to supporting the movement. A striking feature looking back from this distance is how much the Catholic opponents of the Santa Maria movement did not speak up, how much they felt themselves bound by religious and ethnic loyalty not to publicly criticise Mannix, Santa Maria and the movement. Catholic criticisms in print of the movement don't really come to the fore until after the Labor Party split. So let's take us to point number 5. Why did the David Keogh draft of the history not get published? That's a copy of the original page 1 of Dave Keogh's draft. Jumping to 1978, YCW Holdings, that's a registered charity set up by former YCWs to manage the funds and properties of the YCW. YCW Holdings, on behalf of the Melbourne YCW, commissioned David Keogh to research and write a history of the early years. My memory is that the people in Holdings met Keogh, found him enthusiastic, and in a day when there were very few historians writing about Australian Catholicism, appointed him without advertising the position. 3 years later, Dave put in a draft of 150,000 words entitled History of the Melbourne Young Christian Workers 1932 to 1958. He was paid for about half that time and the other half was voluntary. But his chapters 3 and 4 about the Melbourne origins are the only detailed written account available, and they are therefore extremely important to any YCW veteran or any researcher. Now, what happens next is that 7 YCW founders were asked to read the first draft and make a report to Holdings. This is what they reported. Can you read those texts okay, Steph?
Yes, I think it's pretty clear for everybody.
David, I'll run you through, I'll walk you through it, folks. David Keogh had written, this is what the founder said. Keogh has written a painstaking and careful piece of research, but the great vitality and joy of those years did not come out. The draft had failed to do justice to the charismatic leadership of Father Frank Lombard. The draft implies that by putting Kevin Kelly in charge would have been a better option. The draft has not allowed sufficiently for the need to adapt European Joseph's thinking to Australian conditions. The resulting text conveyed an undercurrent of failure. That is a worrying feature of the Keogh draft. And they all recommended not to publish, and Holdings acted on it. And I'm going to add another point. One of the weaknesses in the Keogh thing is he tends to take an unquestioned approach to Santa Maria and his claims. when I was doing my PhD, which Steph referred to, my supervisor, Paul Rule, said to me, don't just say such and such happened, say Santa Maria said that such and such happened. Okay, so in 2024, that's now 2 years ago, Dave Keogh placed a PDF version of his draft with the State Library of Victoria, and it's in the hands of Holdings now to give the okay, but it's all bona fide researchers are now able to see the Keogh document. But I want to stress that I put a proposal to the State Library that for historical accuracy, and I think out of justice to the founders, those founders' comments should be placed alongside Keogh's draft in the State Library. I think that should be in the same PDF actually. And I've put the founders' comments in toto in a chapter of my book. Well, how are we going for time, Steph? I'm going to wind up.
All good, yep.
So, this talk is based on the following proposition. In the middle decades of the 20th century, the YCW played an important role in the social and religious life of Australia. So I'll now just finish up by giving you the main points I've tried to make about that. I think we need fresh emphases about how complicated the situation was in 1941 and how difficult it was for the church to have lost the allegiance of militant trade unionists in the 30s. I remind you that it's Australia, unlike Europe, the church in the 1900s had been for many decades a working class church. But by 1939, the bishops and the Campion Society had become supporters of the right wing, especially over the Spanish Civil War. And in this talk, I think it's a bit against the trend to mention the Catholics who were not for Franco and some who were pro-Republic. And whatever about Franco and so on, the YCW, from influence though the Campions had been in a conservative direction, the message of Cardine, I think, offered a positive alternative to the Santa Maria movement. The transition from talking about ideas to bringing groups of young workers together was largely the result of the initiative of young priests and young workers from industrial suburbs. I think that's an important point. Lombard, Long and McCann were just a few of the many young leaders who emerged. And the turning point was at December 40 training camp at Mornington, where the boys from the pre-existing Catholic Boys Legion were instructed about Cardine's approach, and they changed over to become the YCW. They insisted on Cardine's emphasis on personal formation, and they rejected the top-down control offered by the Santa Maria movement. So the World War had an effect, but so did the parallel setting up of a secret Catholic organisation at the same time. And as is obvious, that all needs further research. So the other bit of new material in this book, I think of mine, is the discussion of David Keogh Commission history, plus the outline of what the founders said was wrong with Keogh's book. But to be fair to both Keogh and the founders, the draft and the criticisms should be made available together at the State Library. Was Father John F. Kelly correct when he said the YCW with its partners, the NCGM and the YCS, was one of God's greatest gifts to the church in Australia? Well, all the evidence we have from speaking to YCW veterans is that many of them found the membership a transforming experience. In the hope that others are going to do further work on the history of the YCW, I've included in my booklet a good deal of other factual information and footnotes. But I do look forward to seeing a women's history being given its full due in the future. Here's hoping that other authors will come forward to fill in the gaps for the general reader, and I hope they write, where possible, a history that makes people like ourselves take pride in ourselves. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you very much, Val. That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure there's many aspects in there that people may wish to react to or respond to or add to. So now it is the time to go over to members of our audience. And if you would like to make a comment or pose a question, we're in a pretty much of a family situation here, so feel free to chime in or put a little question or comment in the chat also is another way to participate. Just while people are getting their thoughts together, if you haven't already, I will also just kind of make a couple of comments myself that on issues that Val has raised. For example, yes, I think it's very important that the whole experience of Spain in the 1930s. It's interesting to note that the YCW in Spain started in the Basque Country and also in Catalonia, which were both opposed to what the Franco forces were doing. One of the founders of the YCW in the Basque Country became the founder of the Mondragon Cooperatives, narrowly escaped execution. And I think it was a similar story in Catalonia, where YCW leaders of that time and priests, I must check the story, but I believe certainly they were oppressed. I'm not sure if any were actually executed, but it was a very conflictual time. But it's interesting to see that in Spain, that was the choice made by those people that became close to the YCW from that period. It's also very clear to see the choice that Lombard and the early leaders made to have a positive answer to communism, and that battle was also repeated in many countries. I'd love to say more about that, but I think if there's other people that would like to enter into the discussion, I'd like to give you the first opportunity. Is there anybody else that would like to jump in at this point?
Yep. No, it's just because that I guess I joined the YCW in the 1980s, early 80s, and I always knew that there was a bit of a history of the YCW during the Vietnam War period, but I never really knew much about it. So I guess that's not the topic today, but it would be really interesting to hear a bit about it at some stage.
All right. Material for another webinar. Yeah, we tried to do one a couple of years ago during COVID. But COVID stopped us. So maybe it's time to come back to that topic again. Yeah.
Hey, Paul,
I think that was probably a real interesting time in the YCW's history from what I know, but I don't really know much.
Just for interest, Paul, a fortnight ago I gave a paper on the 1970 period, 70s, to the local Australian Catholic Historical Society, and we could repeat that if Steph wants at some stage. Yeah.
Yep. Let's do it.
Stefan, if I may say something.
Yep, go for it, Des.
Right. First of all, Val, thank you very much for your overview. I guess I've got to declare a bit of an interest here. My father was Jack Ryan from Victorian Railways, that Jack Brown used to bash up. Members of the Communist Party, members of the Australian Labor Party, so much so the Victorian Police Special Branch had to go with Dad when he attended meetings.
Oh.
So there was a serious situation in Australia. So much so the Five Eyes came out here and told the Labor government that they've got to put in place a proper security structure, which resulted in 1949 ASIO. That also had the trouble, as you may know, the communists waterside workers would not load our ships to take food and equipment to our men fighting in the Pacific. Dad was the railway man, had to go down there and try and convince them that that's un-Australian. Of course, as you know, there's plenty of thugs around, and there was plenty of thugs around then in the Waterside Workers Federation. So Dad needed our security to go with him to try and convince them, and he had very little luck. General MacArthur wanted to send a team down and sort them out, and the Australian Labor government said, no, in Australia you have the right to strike. So when you're sort of looking at all these issues, I think what you have to say to yourself, was there a serious issue for Australia at the time with communism? And I stand back and try and look at this. If the Five Eyes came out here and said we had an issue, that the communists had influenced a number of people, had infiltrated a number of organisations, including the Australian Labor Party, I think that possibly we did have a serious issue here. But as I said in my opening comments, I'm glad you've done the research, because I believe both sides of every story should be put out and then history decide it. I used to catch up with Bob San Maria at funerals, and we discuss about various issues, and it was his wish that a lot of the people that were involved, their files aren't to be made available by ASIO until after the children have all passed on, and which is what Sir Charles Spry of ASIO has agreed. So Mum and Dad had 10 children. My mother wasn't a Catholic until after the 10th child was born, and when Brenda, within a month of being born, was going to become a Catholic, Mum became a Catholic. So she lived through all that as a non-Catholic. So all I'm saying to you, keep up the research, and I think you will find that at the end of the day, possibly Santa Maria, Dr. Mannix and others were fairly right in doing what they did. When the Five Eyes came out to Australia to tell the Labor government, by the way, to start ASIO, which they did, they made the point that Dr. Adele Zeal was Doc Everett's principal private secretary. Now, if you know anything about principal private secretaries to Prime Minister, I do. I had a lot to do with Race Matthews. We'd meet once a year in later years. He was the principal private secretary to Mr. Whitlam. And basically, the principal private secretary is the one who lets people talk to the Prime Minister, so he runs the country. So it's on the basis that Doc Everett, the possible leader of the Labor Party, having a principal private secretary called Mr. Dalziel, that was one of the main tipping points that made the Labor government do something in relation to security in Australia. So by all means, if you've got any feedback you wish to share with me, I'm more than willing. But from what I can see, from what went on in our own family, I believe we had a serious situation on our hands. And if we use the Five Eyes security countries to say something, we had some problems because they came across them through their own workings out in Australia. I think we have to accept there was a problem there. And unfortunately, I won't know exactly all the ins and outs what Dad did, because the rule is until all the children pass on, that Dad's file won't be made available to the public from ASIO.
Thanks a lot for that, Des. You got any comments back, Val?
I'm going to parallel the father's story. My father was bashed up by some of the Carmichael crowd. He was a member of the movement, but he got to about 1967, and he said they brought out a head honcho from the Auto Workers Union of America. What was his name? Anyway, they were a right wing, pro Cold War trade union in America, but they already had long service leave and superannuation and so on, which the Vehicle Builders Union, which my father was in, didn't have. And my father, by 1967, said, we've been too negative. Look at what they got in the States. We didn't get it here. But the other thing on the ARU, have you seen Tom Rigg's book? Tom Rigg.
Yeah.
Tom Rigg's done two
The
books.
answer is I'm aware of it, and the answer is no. And so since
Tommy-
you've brought it up again, I'll try and dig it up. Is it available through the library?
Tom is the secretary of the group of the NCC group in the Railways Union, and Tom and his Tom had been. I first met Tom when he was station master at St Albans, Steph. But Tom wrote a book. He wrote a book about the groupers in the ARU, but he then wrote a booklet about J.J. Brown, and it's that I want to mention now. The last sentence is, "I only wish he had been on our side." So I can take on board your factual stuff, but I still want to stick with the historical judgment, which can we agree to disagree on this? I think they were too negative.
Could I just add
Yeah.
something from like my own research on the origins of the Belgian YCW? There was a similar story there too. They called them socialists in Belgium. Didn't use the word communist very much at that time, but they were what in Australia we call communists, and they were very opposed to the YCW, the JOC in Belgium, and they fought them in every sense of the word. And the early YCW faced similar sort of struggles to what you've both just mentioned. And I think this is important to understand as the background too, because even in the face of that, Cardine and the early YCW took a different option. They rejected the negative anti-communism line. Now, I don't know, I'm not an expert on the origins of the movement in Australia, but also what I've seen in Italy. Some of you may know that there was another version of Catholic Action in Italy, what became known, and it still exists today under the name of Catholic Action, Italian Catholic Action. And there was actually a range of opinions across that as well. But one of the lines was led by a doctor, I think he's a medical doctor, Luigi Gedda. And he was this kind of his line was very close to what the Santa Maria line was in Australia. That is the need for Catholics to organise as Catholics and basically take over the political parties and the institutions that were in civil society. Now, that might have worked in Italy at some level because historically and it was a Catholic country. But in Australia, where Catholics, especially at that time, even now, are a minority, trying to translate that into the Australian context means you're going to end up with the kind of conflict that happened in the Labor Party. And I think this is important to understand too. And there's no doubt it's very, very clear from the second half of the 1940s in the correspondence with the Australian YCW, the Australian YCW leaders were following the Cardine line in rejecting that negative anti-communism idea. So anyway, that's a few comments I can add. Do you want to say anything to that, Val? Or are there other people that would like to offer comments or questions?
It's hard to keep the focus on the YCW and not switch to the movement.
Good point. Yeah, I guess it's hard for people to ask questions about things that happened before most of us were born, and that's unless we've actually looked into the history. Bruce, are you still there? Have you got any comments or questions you'd like to make? That's Bruce Duncan, who wrote his own PhD on the Sandbury and the movement.
Yeah, I'm still here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to listen to this wonderful presentation today, and it's very complicated. The thing that strikes me relating to the Spanish Civil War, which is very current at the moment, is the whole morality of war. And I think we're getting a replay of this. And I particularly mention Jacques Maritain, the French thinker who was Pope Paul VI regarded him as his political philosopher. And before the Spanish Civil War, Maritain had been giving lectures on Catholic social teaching and through Spain, and his response to that later in one of his books was that the church in Spain was neglecting the social issues, neglecting the social justice struggles, and it wasn't doing nearly enough. And he was appalled by this great lake, and I can see it reflected in the United States at the moment. That when people are neglecting the basic issues of justice, like they swing to the right wing in the United States. In other places, they can swing to the left wing because they feel they're getting such a bad deal from the economic system, and and of course they have been. It's just an appalling situation. So that's developed. Why it's current striking me so much. Maritain's thinking is still very relevant. I think it's reflected in what Pope Leo is saying at the moment on the situation of killing in war. And Maritain used to say the first obligation of the church in all these situations of conflict is to eliminate religion from a cause of conflict, so that it became a force for peacemaking and dialogue and so on. And I think at the moment Leo was articulating, the Pope Leo was articulating that very strongly, and but in a lower key without shouting at us, but making these strong points that I think need to be heard. So I just think that the Spanish Civil War is, as you were saying, is a very critical element in a lot of these issues, and we need to learn a bit more from it.
Thanks, Bruce. Val,
Great.
any come back?
No, thanks a lot. One thing about that Italian situation, Stefan, I had one day working in the Catholic University of America once on Irish stuff, but a book sort of fell down in front of me on the Italian 1948 split in the labour movement over there, Jeddah. But the Americans intervened. I was very interested to hear Des say that MacArthur, wanted to intervene. MacArthur mightn't have intervened, but I think he's what do you call the other guys, attachés? They would be pretty interested in the whole development of the movement. But anyway, the book by a bloke called Philly Pelly about the split in the Italian labour movement is very much echoed by the 1954 split in Australia as regards the role of the church and so on. Right. Hey Bruce, I heard you give a talk on the war thing out there at St Dominic's one day on the current situation. Very much appreciated, mate. That was a terrific talk.
Right. Any comments from others? Tim, you came a couple of decades after all that. Do you have any questions or comments you'd like to add? Ruby, from young persons today's point of view, any questions to ask? No obligation, just opportunity.
To fill in the gap on the cold winter evening, can I draw attention to the bloke called Leon McGree, who's down there somewhere? You still there, Leon? Yeah. That booklet that I've written is caused because in about 5 years ago, Peter Wilkinson wrote an article about the plenary council in 1937 and the setting up of the National Secretariat of Catholic Action. And he, in a sort of off the throwaway phrase, said that Santa Maria had been one of the people who started the YCW in Australia. And Leon read that and he sent an email around to a few of us saying, if poor old Lombard and McCann and Long had read this, they'd have turned over in their graves because they spent their lives trying to do different things to what Santa Maria was doing. So we had a bit of an email discussion, a dozen or so of us, but it's taken me 5 years to answer Leon McGree's question a bit more thoroughly. That's why you're getting overload tonight, folks. Leon spent most of his working life working for the YCW cooperatives, and that was one of the very positive things that did come out of the Melbourne YCW.
Up their hand. So I'd like to thank Val for everything he's done, presented here tonight. And he did just mention the book that he wrote. And on our website, you can see the link to actually purchase the book. Maybe if you're in Melbourne, you can even get a signed copy from Val or somebody else. No, somebody's clapping. So thanks very much for that, Kate. So yeah, look, I think it's really important myself to understand how the YCW started, the context in which it started. I think there's a lot to learn for the movement. Again, there's so many things that are interesting. How, for example, it started off with a few young lay people, Kevin Kelly and those Campion people, but then it was picked up by the institutional church in Melbourne, which helped it blossom and become a big movement. Can that happen again today, now or in the future? Who knows? But I think there's so many important names that were there. John F. Kelly, Ted Long, of course, and as Val mentioned, the women leaders of the movement whose story is still yet to be told. So there's a lot to be done, really, if there's any future young researchers with us or whom we're in contact with to try and motivate. And of course, please, some of you here may have documents and archives. If you do have, please make sure they don't get lost. And if you don't know what to do with them, please get in contact with us. And we have to find a way to make sure that those documents are preserved for the future. So I'd just like to thank you again, Val, and thank everybody that's with us tonight for being here. And we hope to see you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks very much.